You think you know how this story goes. The immortal king speaks one cruel word. The human bows her head, and the room breathes easy because she knew her place. This isn't that kind of story. This is about the night the oldest, most feared king in Ebonhaven looked at a waitress he didn't think was worth noticing, insulted her in a language he was certain had died with his ancestors 600 years ago, and she looked him dead in the eye and answered him in that exact language before calling him a coward to his face in front of his entire court. The Crimson Court smelled like aged wine, melted candle wax, and money that had never once belonged to a human hand. Chandeliers older than most nations hung above tables where a single bottle of vintage cost more than a server made in a month. The kind of restaurant built to remind humans, quietly and constantly, exactly where they stood. Leora Bennett's feet had stopped aching hours ago. Now they simply burned. A dull, steady fire climbing from her arches into her calves. 7 hours into a double shift, and the marble floors had long since stopped feeling like a privilege to walk on. I can't take that table. Leora blinked, breaking her stare from a smudge on a wine glass. Mira, one of the newer human staff, stood pale beside the service station, a tray trembling in her hands, though she wasn't even holding anything on it. Can't take what table? Leora asked, already reaching for her notepad. Table 1. The king's table. Mira's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He never comes in person. Never. If I mess this up, it's dinner service, Mira. Not an execution. You don't understand. Mira's eyes were glassy, wide with a fear that lived in her bones. Servers who displease him don't come back to work the next night. They don't come back at all. Leora sighed and tossed her towel onto the counter. Fine. I'll take it. She looked across the dining hall. King Cassian Nightvale sat at the head of the royal table, and the entire room seemed to bend toward him without anyone appearing to move. He wasn't loud. He didn't perform power the way lesser nobles did, with jewels and raised voices and cruel little jokes at a servant's expense. He simply sat there, silver white hair catching the candlelight, a crimson velvet coat immaculate against his still frame, his expression unreadable, and the room adjusted itself around his silence the way water bends around a stone. Beside him, Commander Ronan Ashcroft, alert, one hand resting near his blade out of habit. High Chancellor Mallory Dustmore, watching the room like a man who'd already won every argument in it before it began. Lady Nisera Vale, composed, missing nothing. Leora approached the table, steady and professional. She had learned years ago that fear only ever invited more of it. Good evening, my lords, my lady. May I begin you with something from the reserve cellar? Cassian didn't look at her. He turned instead to Malric and spoke quietly, almost lazily, in a language Leora hadn't heard spoken aloud since she was a child. The cattle grow bold enough to address kings directly these days. For one full heartbeat, the noise of the restaurant dissolved into static. Leora wasn't standing in the Crimson Court anymore. She was 8 years old, cross-legged on her grandfather's study floor, tracing letters from an alphabet he swore had gone extinct, hearing his voice again and again. Never speak this unless history itself demands it. Cassian expected silence. He expected her to lower her eyes and disappear, the way every human before her always had. Instead, Leora lifted her gaze and answered him. In the same language, without a single stumble. A king who hides his insults inside a dead language isn't fearless. She let the silence stretch exactly as long as he had let his. He's a coward. The hall went still enough to hear a single dropped fork 3 tables away. Ronan's hand closed around the hilt of his sword. Malric's expression sharpened into something cold and calculating, already 3 moves ahead of everyone else at the table. Nisera hadn't moved, but her eyes never left the Yora's face. Cassian, the king who had ruled Ebonhaven through 7 centuries of war, grief, and silence, slowly set down his glass. He looked at her now, truly looked, for the first time all evening, the way a man looks at a puzzle missing its most important piece. Who taught you that language? His voice was quiet, even, and far more dangerous for its calm. Every noble at the table turned toward her, waiting for the answer that would decide whether she lived through the night. Leora's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice level, the same way she'd kept it a moment ago. My grandfather. Something shifted behind Cassian's ancient eyes. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to hunger. Take her to the palace, he said. Alive. No one in that hall had expected mercy. No one, least of all Leora, understood that mercy was never what this was. A king did not spare a servant for wounding his pride. He spared her because, for the first time in 600 years, someone had spoken the language of his dead ancestors back to him, and he intended to find out exactly how. What Leora didn't know, as guards escorted her from the Crimson Court into the cold night toward Ebenhaven's palace gates, was that the answer had already cost her everything once before. A house fire no one investigated. A grandfather who vanished without explanation after warning her, again and again, that the day would come when history itself demanded she speak. That day had just arrived. The palace rose ahead of her out of the dark like something carved from the night itself, spires black against a bruised sky, torchlight flickering behind stained glass older than any human kingdom. Leora had served vampire nobility for years, without once stepping past the restaurant's threshold into their world. Now, she walked straight into the heart of it, flanked by silent guards, escorted by a king who hadn't spoken again since ordering her taken alive. She should have been afraid. Part of her was, but underneath it sat something else. A strange, steady calm, as if some part of her had been waiting years for exactly this moment. Her grandfather's warning echoed once more in her mind, clearer now than it had been in a long time. One day, someone will speak these words again. Pray it isn't before you're ready. She wasn't ready. She was about to find out anyway. She wasn't ready. She was about to find out anyway. Behind her, the Crimson Court still hadn't moved. Leora carried the memory of it through the palace gates. Every fork stopped halfway to a mouth, a dozen crystal glasses hanging suspended in midair, as if the vampires holding them had forgotten how hands worked. Ronan's fingers had wrapped around his sword hilt before her sentence was even finished, a reflex older than thought. Malric hadn't reached for a weapon. He hadn't needed to. His eyes had done the calculating instead, cold and immediate, already measuring what a human who spoke the dead language meant for everything he'd spent centuries protecting. Nazera had simply stared, her composure cracking for the first time Leora had ever witnessed, as if the words "he's a coward" had rearranged something fundamental in how she understood the world. And Cassian had risen from his seat slowly, unhurried, the way a mountain might rise if it decided to move. No one in that hall had breathed. Leora certainly hadn't. She'd stood there with her heart slamming against her ribs, waiting for the only sentence a king could reasonably hand down to a servant who had just humiliated him in front of his entire court. He hadn't given her one. He had given her a question instead, spoken so quietly it had barely disturbed the silence around it. Who taught you? She hadn't lied. There hadn't seemed to be any point. My grandfather, and then, instead of the word she'd braced for, instead of execution, instead of guards, he had said something else entirely. Take her to the palace, alive. The memory looped in her mind now as the gates of Ebenhaven Palace rose ahead of her, black iron twisted into shapes that looked like thorns, or claws, or both. Two guards flanked her. Silent as the dead, their crimson-lined cloaks the only spot of color against the dark stone walls. Neither of them had spoken to her since leaving the restaurant. Neither of them had needed to. Their silence said everything. You are not a guest, and you are not yet a prisoner, and no one here knows what you are. That made two of them. Leora had spent years learning how to disappear inside a room full of vampires, how to keep her expression neutral, her voice level, her presence forgettable enough that no one looked twice at the human refilling their wine. It had kept her alive. It had kept her safe. Tonight, in the space of a single sentence, she had undone 7 years of careful invisibility, and there was no taking it back now. The words were already loose in the world. He is a coward. She could still feel them in her mouth, sharp-edged and foreign and true. She thought about her grandfather as the gates groaned open in front of her. He had taught her the ancient vampire tongue in stolen hours, always after dark, always with the curtains drawn, always with that same warning pressed into her like a brand. Never speak this unless history itself demands it. She had asked him once, half laughing, half afraid, what exactly would count as history demanding it. He hadn't laughed back. He'd only looked at her with an expression she hadn't understood until years later, the look of a man who already knew he wouldn't be there to see whatever moment he was preparing her for. He had vanished not long after. No explanation. No goodbye. Just an empty chair at the breakfast table, and a silence that had never been filled. She wondered, walking through gates built by people who despised her kind, whether tonight was the moment he'd meant. The courtyard beyond the gates was vast and unnervingly quiet, lit by torches that burned an unnatural shade of blue-white, throwing long shadows across black stone. Statues lined the path, vampire kings and queens long dead, their carved faces worn smooth by centuries of weather, their stone eyes somehow still managing to look disapproving. Leora kept her chin level and her steps even, refusing to let the guards see her hands shake. Even though they were shaking, even though every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, running would accomplish nothing. She had grown up learning that lesson the hard way, long before Evanhaven, long before the Crimson Court. You didn't run from something faster and older and hungrier than you. You stood still, and you stayed sharp, and you waited for the moment it made a mistake. She wasn't foolish enough to think Cassian Nightvale made many mistakes. The palace itself rose ahead of her now close enough that she could make out individual details. Gothic spires clawing at a moon-washed sky, stained glass windows glowing faintly from within, ivy the color of dried blood creeping up walls that had stood since before her country had a name. It was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful. It was beautiful because it wanted you to forget, for just a moment, exactly how much it could hurt you. At the base of the grand entrance, the guards finally stopped. One of them pushed open a door taller than 3 men, standing shoulder to shoulder, its iron hinges groaning with the weight of centuries. Beyond it, Leora caught her first glimpse of the interior. A hall so vast it swallowed sound, its ceiling lost somewhere in shadow above the reach of torchlight. Portraits lined the walls in unbroken rows, pale, ageless faces staring down with the same unreadable calm she'd seen on Cassian himself, as if stillness were bred into this bloodline generation after generation. A staircase wide enough to hold a small army curved upward into darkness. Somewhere far off, a single door closed, deliberate and quiet, and then nothing at all. No servants moved through the hall, no voices carried from distant rooms. For a palace housing the most powerful vampire in the kingdom, it felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum that had forgotten to stop pretending to be lived in. Leora hesitated for exactly 1 breath, weighing the last few seconds in which turning back was still, in theory, a choice. It wasn't, really. Not since the moment she'd opened her mouth in that dining hall and let 7 years of silence break apart on a single sentence. Whatever waited inside these walls. Answers. Danger, her grandfather's ghost finally catching up to her. She had chosen it the instant she decided a king's cruelty deserved a response instead of a bowed head. Then she stepped through, into Evanhaven Palace, into the last place in the world any human had ever been invited to walk, uninvited, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a verdict. Leora had spent the walk from the courtyard to the palace doors bracing herself for a cell. Stone walls, iron chains, perhaps a room with no window, built specifically for humans who spoke words they weren't supposed to know. Instead, the guards led her past the grand staircase down a corridor lined with tall, arched windows that looked out over a moonlit garden, and stopped before a set of double doors carved with symbols she recognized instantly. Not decoration, but language. Old language. Her language, or what little of it she'd been permitted to inherit. The doors opened onto a room that made her forget, for 1 full breath, to be afraid. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, curving away into shadow on either side, packed with scrolls, bound manuscripts, and stacks of parchment yellowed by centuries. The air smelled of dust and old ink, the particular scent of things that had waited a very long time to be read again. High above, a domed ceiling painted with constellations, long faded, caught the moonlight filtering through narrow windows, scattering pale silver across the reading tables below. A single vampire attendant stood near the entrance, bowed once toward the king, and vanished without a word, leaving Leora alone in a room with the man she had called a coward 3 hours earlier. Cassian moved through the archive as though he owned every book on every shelf, which, she supposed, he technically did. He stopped in front of a case protected behind glass and drew out a scroll with the kind of care most people reserved for something breathing. "Nobody in this palace can read this," he said, setting it on the long table between them. "Nobody in this kingdom. I've had scholars try for decades. They manage perhaps 1 word in 20. And even that is a guess, dressed up as scholarship. Leora didn't move toward it. And you think I can do better? I think, Cassian said. You're about to prove it, or you're about to prove you were lying to me in that dining hall. Either way, I'll know within the next 5 minutes. She stepped forward and looked down at the scroll. The symbols swam for a moment, not because she didn't know them, but because seeing this many at once, this old, this real, sent something through her chest that felt dangerously close to grief. Her grandfather had taught her from fragments, worn photographs of tablets, a handful of pages copied from a book he refused to explain the origin of. She had never once in her entire life held something like this. She began to read aloud, translating as she went, her voice steady even as her pulse wasn't. In the 3rd year of the Concord, the Crimson Court opened its gates to the human delegations for the first time in living memory. King Aldrich Nightvale stood before both peoples and swore that the blood between them would no longer be spilled, but shared in friendship if both sides were brave enough to choose it. She looked up. Cassian's expression hadn't changed, but something in his stillness had shifted, the way a held breath shifts the air in a room even before it's released. Keep going, he said. She did. For nearly an hour she read while he listened, occasionally correcting her on a name or a place she stumbled over, occasionally falling completely silent for stretches so long she wondered if she'd said something wrong. She hadn't. She understood, somewhere around the 4th scroll, that he wasn't testing her anymore. He was simply listening to his own history, spoken aloud in a voice for the first time in longer than she could imagine. This isn't what I expected, she admitted, setting down a scroll detailing a treaty negotiated jointly by human elders and vampire nobility, both sides signing in the same ceremony, under the same moon. Everything I've ever heard about Evanhaven, about vampires, it's all fear, cruelty, humans as cattle or servants or worse. That's what it became, Cassian said quietly. It wasn't always. Something in his voice made her look up from the parchment. There was a time, he continued, when this kingdom believed peace was possible. When I believed it. He said the words like they cost him something to hand over, coins from a treasury he'd sealed shut a long time ago. I fought for it, for years. I stood in rooms very much like this one and argued that humans and vampires could share a world without one devouring the other. What happened? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached past her and drew out a smaller journal, its leather cover cracked with age, and set it on the table without opening it. This belonged to someone I knew, he said. It's written in a private hand, faster, sloppier than the formal texts. If you can read it, you'll understand more about this kingdom's history than every scholar currently breathing. Leora hesitated, some instinct warning her this wasn't simply another test. But she opened the cover anyway and began to read the looping, hurried script inside, a private diary, intimate in a way the treaties and formal records hadn't been. Thoughts, doubts, small human observations about a war neither side had wanted, written by someone who clearly hadn't expected anyone else to ever read them. And then, halfway down the first page, she found a name, written and underlined twice, as though the person writing it had needed, even privately, even only to themselves, to make certain it was real. Elandriel. Leora glanced up at Cassian. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before tonight. Not the cold stillness of a king, not the calculating patience of a captor, but something raw and unguarded. Something that looked, for just a moment, like grief that had never once been allowed to finish. She thought of every version of him she'd assembled in the space of a single evening, the tyrant who insulted servants for sport, the king who spared a life instead of taking it, the strategist who tested her like a weapon he wasn't yet sure how to aim. None of those versions accounted for this. For a man standing in a room full of his own dead history, listening to a stranger read aloud the name of someone he clearly hadn't said in a very long time. She said nothing. She only looked back down at the name and understood, without needing to be told, that she had just found the first crack in 700 years of armor. Cassian didn't reach for the journal again that night. He simply nodded once toward it and said, "Continue." And Leora understood that whatever door had opened between them wasn't going to close just because it made him uncomfortable. So she read. The entries were sparse at first, the observations of a man too occupied with matters of state to write often. Troop movements along the northern border. frustration with a council that argued in circles for the sake of arguing, a brief, almost embarrassed note about a garden he'd had planted for someone because she'd once mentioned missing the smell of orange blossoms from her childhood home. Leora found herself picturing him kneeling in dirt, arranging seedlings by hand rather than ordering a gardener to do it, and the image sat so strangely against everything she'd assumed about him that she had to read the line twice. Then further in, the handwriting changed, looser, faster, happier. In the specific way handwriting could be happier, as though the handwriting it had somewhere better to be. Elandriel laughed today at something so foolish I'm ashamed to write it down. I have commanded armies. I have negotiated with kings who wanted my head on a pike. I have never once felt as powerless as I did standing in that garden. Unable to stop smiling at her, Leora read the words aloud, and then went quiet, sensing she'd stepped somewhere private enough that even translating it out loud felt like trespassing. "Keep going," Cassian said again, but this time his voice had lost its usual flatness. She kept going. The entries painted a portrait she wouldn't have believed an hour ago, a version of Cassian who argued passionately for peace summits, who spent hours in that same archive searching for precedent to support treaties his own council thought were suicide, who wrote more than once that he believed the war between vampires and humans could end within his lifetime, if enough people were simply brave enough to want it to. Then the entries stopped mentioning treaties. They started mentioning fear. The blood moon rises in 3 days. Elandriel insists on attending the border talks despite my objections. She says a queen who hides from danger isn't a queen humans will ever trust. I cannot argue with her logic. I can only hate it. The next entry was the last one in the journal, and it wasn't written in the same hand at all. The script was jagged, torn into the page hard enough to nearly pierce through it in places. She is gone. They came under the blood moon, when our strength is weakest and theirs is strongest, and they took her from me in the space it takes to draw a single breath. I begged the council for restraint. I argued for peace for a decade. I have nothing left to argue with now. Leora stopped reading. The silence stretched long enough that she finally looked up. Cassian was standing perfectly still, the way he'd been standing in the restaurant hours earlier, except now she understood that the stillness wasn't power. It was containment. It was 700 years of a wound that had never been permitted to close, held in place by nothing but sheer, exhausting will. She thought of every insult she'd ever heard traded about him in the servants' quarters, the frozen king, the man with no heart left to break, and understood now that they'd all gotten it backward. He didn't have no heart left. He had one heart, still breaking, 7 centuries later, and an entire kingdom that had mistaken the sound of it for silence. "I called you a coward," she said quietly. "You didn't know. That's not the point." She set the journal down with a care she hadn't shown it before. "I stood in that dining hall and decided I understood exactly who you were, based on nothing. I was wrong." Cassian's jaw tightened, some old reflex resisting the sympathy in her voice. "Careful," he said. "I built an entire kingdom's fear around being exactly the man you accused me of being. Don't mistake one conversation for absolution. I'm not offering absolution. I'm offering an apology." He didn't answer that. He turned instead toward the window, where the moon hung low and pale over the palace gardens, and said nothing for a long moment, and Leora let him have the silence. Elsewhere in the palace, Lady Nysera Vale stood in the private corridor, arms crossed, facing Malric Duskmore, with an expression carefully arranged to reveal nothing. She had learned centuries ago that Malric read faces the way scholars read scrolls, and she had no intention of giving him anything to translate tonight. "The human should already be dead," Malric said, his voice pitched low enough not to carry. "Instead, she's sitting in the royal archives, reading things no living soul should be reading." "The king gave the order himself," Nysera said. "Or has that stopped mattering to you? The king is grieving something he buried 7 centuries ago badly, and it's clouding his judgment." Malric's eyes were flat, calculating in the way they always were before he made a decision he considered inevitable. "A human who speaks the ancient tongue is not a curiosity, Nysera. She's a liability that could unravel everything this crown has worked to bury." "So you'll do what, exactly? Contradict him?" Malric smiled thinly. "I'll simply ensure the problem resolves itself before it becomes his problem to solve." Nasera's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. That sounds like treason, Chancellor. It sounds, Malbrook said, already turning to leave. Like loyalty to a kingdom that cannot survive its king's sentiment. He didn't wait for her response. He continued down the corridor, already composing in his mind the exact words he would use with the two men waiting for him in the lower gatehouse. Men who asked no questions, left no witnesses, and had never once failed to finish what they were paid to start. He had used them before, quietly, on problems the crown could never officially acknowledge. This would be no different. A dead servant girl was a tragedy. A dead servant girl who read forbidden languages was a mercy the kingdom would never know it needed. By the time the eastern sky began its first pale thread of dawn, the order had already been given. The human girl would not survive the week. Yor didn't hear the assassins arrive. She heard the silence that came before them. The way the archive's usual quiet shifted into something heavier. The way the candle flames along the far wall guttered in a draft that shouldn't have existed in a sealed room. Cassian heard it too. He was on his feet before she'd fully registered the change, his hand closing around her wrist and pulling her behind him in the same motion. Down, he said, and she dropped without questioning why. Just as the archive's tall windows shattered inward in a spray of glass and moonlight, 3 figures moved through the wreckage with a speed that blurred the edges of her vision. Dressed in dark leathers, faces hidden beneath hoods that marked them as something other than palace guards. Liora's mind, still catching up, registered one clear fact before anything else. Whoever they were, they hadn't come for the king. They'd come for her. The first blade came fast, aimed low, meant to end things quietly. Cassian caught the assassin's wrist mid-strike and broke it with a sound that turned Liora's stomach. Then drove the man backward into a shelf hard enough to bring down a decade of carefully preserved scrolls in a storm of parchment and dust. The second attacker went for Liora directly while Cassian was occupied, and for one frozen half-second she understood, with total clarity, that she was about to die in a room full of books she'd only just learned to love. Then Ronan was there. He came through the shattered doorway like something unleashed, his sword already moving before his boots hit the floor, and the second assassin barely had time to turn before Ronan cut the fight short with brutal, practiced efficiency. The third attacker hesitated, weighing odds that had just shifted badly against him, and made the choice to run. Cassian caught him before he reached the broken window, and whatever happened in the 2 seconds after that, Liora made herself not watch too closely. When it was over, the archive looked like a battlefield. Glass and parchment scattered across the floor. One shelf collapsed entirely, the smell of blood mixing with old ink and dust. Liora was still on her knees where she'd dropped, her hands pressed flat against the cold stone, her heart hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Cassian crouched in front of her, and for the first time since the dining hall, his expression held nothing calculated at all. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands hadn't quite stopped shaking. "You knew. You reacted before they even broke the window. I've had 600 years of practice recognizing when a room is about to become a battlefield." He helped her to her feet, his grip firm, careful in a way that surprised her more than the violence had, as though some part of him were checking, deliberately, that she was still whole. This wasn't a random attack, Liora. Someone inside this palace wanted you dead tonight, specifically, and they wanted it to look like chaos rather than intention. Ronan wiped his blade clean, his expression grim. "I'll have the bodies searched. If we're fortunate, they'll carry something that tells us who sent them." They were fortunate in a manner of speaking. Tucked inside the dead attacker's coat, Ronan found a folded scrap of parchment bearing a wax seal Liora didn't recognize, but Cassian clearly did, his jaw tightening the moment he saw it. "Chancellor's seal," he said quietly. "Personal, not official. He wouldn't have used it unless he was certain it would never be found." Liora felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the broken window letting in the night air. "Malric wants me dead. Malric wants a problem removed before it becomes larger than he can manage," Cassian corrected, though his tone suggested he understood exactly how thin that distinction was, which means whatever you know, or whatever he thinks you might find, frightens him considerably more than he's let on. It was that fear more than anything else that sent them back into the archive's deeper shelves before dawn. Not to the formal treaties or royal chronicles, but to a locked cabinet, Cassian hadn't opened, he admitted, in over a century. Inside were manuscripts that had never been catalogued, records someone had deliberately buried beneath layers of dust and neglect. Leora began translating, and within the hour, her hands had gone still on the page. The manuscripts told a story very different from the one in the formal histories. Treaties Malric had personally overseen, altered after the fact to shift blame for broken agreements onto human delegations who'd signed in good faith. Border skirmishes, quietly engineered rather than provoked, blamed afterward on human aggression to justify wars the Council had wanted for territorial reasons of their own. Scholars who had come too close to the truth, dismissed from their posts, exiled, or simply erased from the palace's official records entirely, their names surviving only in the margins. Malric's editors had failed to fully scrub clean. Page after page, the pattern repeated itself with the cold consistency of a man who had spent centuries perfecting the art of rewriting inconvenient truths into convenient lies. And then, near the bottom of a ledger dated 17 years earlier, a single entry that made the room around Leora tilt sideways. A payment, a location, a date that matched precisely to the week her parents had died in a fire no authority had ever properly investigated. Her hands began to shake. Leora. Cassian's voice reached her from somewhere far away. What is it? She turned the ledger toward him, her finger resting on the entry, unable to make her voice work for several long seconds. The room felt suddenly too small, the candlelight too bright, 17 years of half-answers and unanswered questions rushing forward all at once, demanding to finally be believed. My parents didn't die in an accident, she finally said. Someone paid for that fire. Someone erased the investigation before it could ever begin. She looked up at him, the weight of 17 years settling over her all at once. I think Malric killed my family. Cassian didn't try to comfort her with words. He seemed to understand, without being told, that words would have felt hollow against something this large. Instead, he simply sat with her among the scattered manuscripts and let the silence hold the space that platitudes couldn't fill. It was Leora who broke it. Eventually, her voice steadier than she expected. I need to know what happened to my grandfather. If Malric ordered my parents killed, then his disappearance wasn't a coincidence either. I need to know. Cassian nodded once. Then we look. Quietly. If Malric already sent assassins after you tonight, he won't hesitate to bury this deeper if he learns we're searching. They moved through the palace's lower archives before the household stirred, avoiding the main corridors, taking passages Cassian clearly hadn't used in decades, but remembered anyway. The way a person remembers the shape of a childhood home long after they've stopped living in it. The deeper levels of the palace felt older than the halls above. The stone walls unadorned, the air colder, as though the building itself had never bothered dressing up the parts no one important was meant to see. In a records room, sealed behind a door disguised as a storage closet, they found what Leora had spent 7 years afraid to look for. Prisoner intake logs. Names, dates, causes of detainment, recorded in a hand too careless to be anything but routine, as though the men writing them had long since stopped thinking of the names as people. Halfway down the third page, Leora found him. Bennett, Edmund, human. Detained for suspected possession of prohibited knowledge, held for interrogation regarding the ancient vampire tongue. Her breath caught. She kept reading, her hands trembling harder with every line. The logs were sparse, clinical, but they told her enough. Her grandfather had been taken not long after her parents' deaths, held in a cell beneath the palace and pressured. The records used gentler words. But she understood exactly what they meant. To translate a collection of texts Malric had wanted deciphered. Texts, she suspected, that would have exposed exactly the kind of manipulation she and Cassian had already uncovered. He had refused. Again and again, according to the log's cold notations, spanning weeks that stretched into months. The final entry was dated nearly 7 years ago. Subject: deceased. Refused cooperation until the end. Body disposed of per standard protocol. No further translation obtained. Leora made a sound she didn't recognize as her own, something between a gasp and a sob, torn loose from a place she'd kept sealed for years without realizing how much pressure had built up behind it. 7 years of believing he'd simply vanished. 7 years of half-formed hope that somewhere, somehow, he might still be alive, teaching someone else the language he'd once warned her never to speak carelessly. All of it collapsed at once, replaced by the brutal, final certainty of ink on a page. A bureaucrat's cold shorthand for a man who had given everything and received nothing but a line in a ledger no one was ever meant to read. He had died protecting exactly what she'd used to save her own life in that dining hall. He had died so the language would survive in someone, even if it couldn't survive in him. Cassian moved before she fully registered, crossing the small distance between them and pulling her against him, his arms closing around her with a carefulness that suggested he wasn't entirely certain of the gesture himself, as if he'd forgotten the exact shape of it. It had been centuries, she would learn later, since he'd held anyone at all, since Elandriel, since the last time comfort had been something he offered rather than something he'd trained himself not to need. Leora didn't resist it. She pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself break, fully, for the first time in 7 years, in the arms of a king she'd called a coward less than a day earlier. He was braver than anyone I've ever known, she said, once she could speak again. He died rather than hand Malric a weapon. Then his death meant something, Cassian said quietly, and it won't go unanswered. They stayed like that longer than either of them acknowledged aloud. And when they finally separated, something between them had shifted permanently, in a way neither seemed inclined to name yet. Nazira found them not long after, having tracked their absence from the archive to the sealed records room through nothing more than careful attention and old instincts sharpened by centuries of watching a court where nothing happened by accident. She took one look at the prisoner log still open on the table and understood everything without needing an explanation. I suspected as much, she said quietly. I never had proof. Malric has always been careful. Not careful enough, Cassian said. Nasera's expression hardened into something Leora hadn't seen from her before, a decision finally made, after what was clearly years of quiet doubt. Then let me help finish what you started. I've watched him manipulate this council for centuries and told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I'm done telling myself that. Leora felt something steady settle into her chest for the first time since entering the palace. Not safety. Not yet. But the sense that the walls closing in around her had just gained one more person determined to help push them back. It wasn't safety that arrived a few hours later, however. It was Malric himself, standing in the doorway of the records room with an expression that made it immediately, coldly clear that he already knew precisely what they'd found. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look afraid either, which unsettled Leora more than either reaction would have, as though he'd already accounted for this exact moment weeks or months ago, and had simply been waiting to see who would arrive at it first. I see, he said softly, his eyes moving from the open ledger to the 3 faces watching him, that we've reached the part of the evening where pretense is no longer useful. Malric didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. Hoo-hoo. He simply raised his voice, and the sound of it carried through the records room's open door, down the corridor, and out into a palace that had been waiting, Leora realized with a sick lurch, for exactly this moment. Guards. Malric's tone shifted from soft to commanding in the space of a single word. The king has betrayed his own crown. He harbors a human spy within these walls and conspires with traitors to weaken this kingdom from within. I call for his removal in the name of every vampire who still remembers what loyalty means. For one suspended second, nothing happened. Then the palace answered him. Footsteps thundered from multiple directions at once, some loyal to the crown, some already turned weeks or months ago, by whatever promises Malric had been quietly making in corridors. No one thought to watch. Alarm bells began ringing somewhere above them, a deep, mournful sound that Leora understood, without needing it explained, meant the kingdom was tearing itself apart. He's been planning this, Cassian said, already moving, already calculating. Tonight wasn't an accident. He needed a reason the council would accept, and we just handed him one. Then we take it back, Nasera said, drawing herself up with the composure of someone who had spent centuries preparing, without knowing it, for exactly this moment. I still have loyalty among half the Crimson Council. I can rally them before Malric convinces the rest. Go, Cassian said. Leora, the ledger. I have it. She was already gathering the evidence, the translated pages, the prisoner logs, pressing them against her chest like something that might save all of them if it survived the next hour. If this gets out to the full council, they'll see what he really is. Then you need to get it there. Ronan said, appearing in the doorway with his sword already drawn. Blood from the earlier attack still dried along one edge. I'll clear a path. My guard is still mine, whatever Malric claims. The palace had become a battlefield within minutes. Leora ran through corridors she barely recognized, Ronan cutting a path ahead of her through guards loyal to Malric's claim. The sound of steel and shouting echoing off walls built for royal ceremony rather than civil war. Portraits she'd admired hours earlier now watched a kingdom collapse beneath them. Centuries of careful stillness finally shattered. Smoke had begun curling through the eastern wing already. Some torch or lantern knocked loose in the chaos, and somewhere below them she could hear the deep, splintering crash of something large giving way. Twice hands reached for her. Once, a guard she didn't recognize, once horribly. Someone in palace livery she'd seen serving wine at official functions, and twice Ronan intervened before she had to find out what would have happened if he hadn't. She kept running, kept the papers pressed against her chest, kept telling herself that if she could just reach the Crimson Council chamber, if Nasira could just hold long enough, none of this would be for nothing. Somewhere in her mind, absurdly, she thought of her grandfather's warning spoken across a lifetime ago in a quiet room with the curtains drawn. History itself will demand it, and understood. Running through a burning palace with evidence of murder clutched to her chest that history had never demanded anything gently. She didn't see Cassian fall, she only heard it, a sound behind her further back in the corridor, a shift in the fighting that felt different from everything before it, and when she risked a glance over her shoulder, she saw him surrounded. 6 guards where there should have been none, blades leveled at a king who had never in 700 years needed anyone to defend him. Go. His voice cut through the chaos, aimed directly at her. Leora, get to the council. That's the only thing that matters now. I'm not leaving you. You're not saving me by staying, he said, and something in his voice, some terrible calm certainty, told her he'd already accepted what was about to happen. You're saving everyone else. Go. Ronan grabbed her arm, pulling her forward before she could argue further, his expression carved from something that looked almost like grief already forming ahead of schedule. He's right. We can't win this corridor. We can still win the war. She ran, because there was nothing else to do, because staying would have meant dying uselessly beside him instead of finishing what he'd asked of her. Behind her, she heard Cassian's voice one final time, not a plea. Not fear, but something closer to command, the voice of a king even in the moment of his own capture, refusing to let the last thing his people heard from him be weakness. The Crimson Council chamber, when she finally reached it with Ronan half carrying her through the final stretch, was already in chaos. Nasira stood at its center, having gathered perhaps half the council to her side, arguing fiercely against members who had already begun repeating Malric's accusations, as though they'd invented them personally. She's here, Nasira called out, seeing Leora in the doorway, evidence still clutched against her chest. Now, before this goes any further, Leora stepped forward on legs that barely held her and began in a voice shaking with exhaustion and grief and fury in equal measure to read the evidence aloud. The forged treaties, the manufactured wars, the murdered scholars. The ledger entry that connected a chancellor's coin to a fire that had taken her parents 17 years ago. The chamber went silent in a way that felt, for the first time all night, like something other than danger. But silence wouldn't save Cassian. Somewhere in the palace behind her, in a corridor she'd been forced to abandon, the king of Ebenhaven had already been taken, chained, disarmed, and dragged toward whatever fate Malric had decided a traitor to his own crown deserved. She could still hear the echo of his last words to her, the command wrapped inside them, and she understood, with a clarity that hurt more than the running had, that he had chosen this. He had chosen her survival, and the council's chance at the truth, over his own. The kingdom hadn't just begun to burn, it had already lost its king. Nasira wanted her hidden. Ronan wanted her sent somewhere beyond the palace walls entirely, somewhere Malric's reach couldn't easily follow. Leora refused both. He's going to parade Cassian in front of the kingdom, she said, already moving toward the door before either of them could argue further. He needs a public execution to make the coup look righteous instead of what it actually is. That means the throne room. That means everyone will be there to hear whatever lie he's prepared. Which is exactly why you shouldn't be, Ronan said. It's exactly why I have to be. She held up the ledger, the translated pages, everything she'd carried through a burning palace to reach this point. He's spent centuries controlling what this kingdom believes because no one could read the truth back to them. I can. That's the only weapon I have, and I'm not leaving it in a council chamber while he kills the king in front of everyone who still trusts him. Nisera studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and final. Then we go together. Half the council believes you already. Let's make sure the rest of Ebenhaven does too. The throne room was packed. By the time they arrived, nobles and citizens alike pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath banners that had watched 7 centuries of Night Vale rule, all of them summoned or drawn by rumor to witness whatever Malric intended to make of this night. Cassian knelt to the room's center, chained, flanked by guards loyal to the coup, his expression carrying none of the fear the moment demanded and all of the cold fury it deserved. Malric stood before the throne itself, addressing the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire existence learning exactly how to sound righteous. "Tonight, your king stands accused of treason," he announced, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the vast room. "He has harbored a human within these walls, shared our history with her freely, and allowed her presence to bring assassins and chaos into the heart of Ebenhaven. I take no pleasure in this, but a kingdom that cannot protect itself from its own king's weakness does not deserve to call itself a kingdom at all." "That's not the history he's protecting," Leora said, stepping forward before fear could talk her out of it. "It's the history you buried." Every head in the throne room turned toward her at once. Malric's composure flickered, just slightly, just enough for Leora to see it. "The human speaks," he said, forcing lightness into his voice that didn't quite land. "How fitting. Guards, let her speak." Cassian's voice cut through the chamber despite the chains, despite the guards, despite everything Malric had arranged to silence him. "If you're so certain of your own righteousness, Chancellor, you shouldn't fear one woman's words." Malric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, and Leora understood she wouldn't get a longer invitation than this. She raised the ledger and began to read in the ancient vampire tongue, first, then in the common tongue, so that no one in the room, human sympathizer or vampire noble, could claim afterward that they hadn't understood exactly what she'd exposed. The forged treaties, the manufactured wars, the scholars erased from history for refusing to lie on Malric's behalf, her grandfather's death, recorded in cold bureaucratic language by a man who had never once expected his own words to be read back to him in front of the kingdom he'd spent centuries manipulating. The throne room's silence deepened with every line, until it wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of belief. "Lies," Malric said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Fabrications, invented by a human desperate to save the king who sheltered her." "Then explain your seal," Ronan said, stepping forward with the wax-stamped parchment recovered from the assassin's coat, on an order to have her killed before she ever reached this room. Something in Malric's expression finally cracked. "Enough," he snarled, and drew a blade from beneath his robes with a speed that betrayed exactly how long he'd been prepared for this outcome to turn against him. He moved toward Cassian, chains or no chains, clearly intending to end this the only way he had left. He never reached him. Cassian broke his restraints with a violence that scattered guards who'd been careless enough to stand too close. 700 years of contained strength finally released in a single motion. The two of them met in the center of the throne room, blade against blade, the sound of it ringing off ancient stone while the entire kingdom watched its king fight for his crown and his life in the same breath. It didn't last long. Malric was cunning, but Cassian had survived centuries of war. Malric had only ever orchestrated from a safe distance, and the difference showed within minutes. Ronan cut down 2 of the coup's remaining loyalists near the throne. Nisera, flanked now by council members who'd finally seen enough to choose a side, moved through the chamber, arresting the officials who'd backed Malric's claim. Cassian disarmed Malric with a final, brutal strike that sent the Chancellor's blades skittering across the marble floor, and stood over him with a killing blow well within reach. The room held its breath. "Finish it," Malric spat, some final desperate defiance surfacing even now. "Prove I was right about you." Cassian lowered his sword. "No," he said, quiet enough that the whole silent room heard it anyway. You spent centuries convincing this kingdom that power meant cruelty. I will prove you right in the last moment you'll ever have influence over anything. You'll face judgment. Real judgment. From the council you tried to corrupt. For the crimes you actually committed. He turned to the crowd, chains still hanging broken from his wrists. Blood and exhaustion written across every line of him. Ebonhaven doesn't need another act of vengeance tonight, he said. It needs the truth. Tonight, it finally has it. The war ended not with another death, but with the sound of an entire kingdom, human and vampire alike, finally exhaling at once. Ebonhaven took months to rebuild, and longer than that to trust the quiet that followed. But it did rebuild. Stone by stone, treaty by treaty. One careful conversation at a time between two peoples who had spent centuries being told the other side was something to fear. The Crimson Council, purged of the officials who'd backed Malric's coup, sat for the first time in the kingdom's history, with human delegates seated as equals rather than guests tolerated on sufferance. The negotiations were slow and difficult, and occasionally furious, but they were honest, and Leora understood watching from the chamber's edge more often than not. That honest had been the one thing this kingdom had been missing for 700 years. Cassian presided over all of it. Patient in ways she suspected surprised even him, firm when firmness was needed, but never again. With the cold distance she'd first mistaken for cruelty in a restaurant that felt like a lifetime ago now. On a bright spring morning in a ceremony held in the palace courtyard where Leora had once walked as a prisoner, Cassian stood before the assembled court and formally honored the memory of Edmund Bennett, scholar, protector of a dying language. A man who had died so that 700 years of history could survive to be told truthfully. This kingdom owes its future to a man it once imprisoned, Cassian said, his voice carrying across a courtyard filled with humans and vampires standing shoulder to shoulder for the first time in living memory. Let his name be remembered, not as a footnote in someone else's cruelty, but as the reason the ancient vampire tongue survives it all. Leora stood beside him, her eyes wet, her chest full of something too large to name, simply grief. Still, but grief finally given somewhere honest to rest. In the weeks that followed, she founded the academy she'd once only dreamed of in stolen study sessions on her grandfather's floor, a place beneath the palace where humans and vampires studied the ancient vampire tongue side by side, where a language once nearly erased by centuries of fear and secrecy would never again depend on a single surviving voice to carry it forward. She stood at the front of the first class herself, teaching the alphabet her grandfather had taught her, watching young faces, human and vampire, both trace the same letters that had once nearly gotten her killed for knowing them. It was Cassian who found her there one evening, long after the students had gone, standing alone among the empty desks with a quiet, uncharacteristic hesitation in his posture. "The peace treaty is finalized," he said. "Officially, formally, Ebonhaven and the human territories are no longer at war, for the first time in longer than most of my council can remember." "That's good news," Leora said, though something in his tone told her he hadn't come only to deliver it. "It means you're free to leave, if you wish." He said it evenly, carefully, the way he'd learned to say difficult things when he genuinely meant to offer them without pressure attached. "You came to this palace as a prisoner, then stayed as something closer to a partner in all of this. You've given Ebonhaven more than any human in its history. You don't owe it anything further. If you want to go, build a life somewhere free of vampire courts and old grief and all the danger that seems to follow me, I'll open every gate myself." Leora studied him for a long moment. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," he admitted quietly, like a confession he'd been withholding out of some old exhausted fear that wanting things simply invited losing them. "I want you to stay, but I won't ask you to stay for my sake alone. Not after everything this place has already cost you." "Then it's fortunate," Leora said, closing the distance between them, "that I'm not staying for your sake alone either." Something in his expression shifted, careful hope breaking through centuries of practiced restraint. "I'm staying because this academy matters, because there are children in that courtyard who will grow up never knowing a world where humans and vampires couldn't sit at the same table." She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. "And because I love you. Not despite everything that happened in that dining hall, or this palace, or that throne room. Because of the man I found underneath all of it. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she'd rarely heard from him. For 700 years, I believed grief was the same thing as loyalty, that holding on to the pain of losing Elandril was the only way to prove I truly loved her at all. I thought moving forward would mean forgetting her, betraying her memory. And now I understand that living isn't a betrayal of the dead, he said. You taught me that. Or reminded me, in a language I'd nearly forgotten how to hear. Living is the greatest way to honor the people we've lost, Leora said softly. My grandfather didn't die so I could spend the rest of my life afraid to speak, or love, or live fully because of what it cost him. He died so I could do exactly this. Cassian reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that belonged to no version of him she'd met that first night in the Crimson Court. Then let us live, he said, fully, together, and let that be the truest honor either of us can offer the people we've lost. He kissed her then, slowly, in an empty academy built from a language that had nearly died with her grandfather, surrounded by desks where a new generation was already learning to speak it freely. It wasn't the kiss of a king and a servant, or a captor and a prisoner, or even simply two people who had survived a war together. It was the kiss of two people who had finally chosen honesty over fear and found, on the other side of it, exactly what both of them had spent far too long believing they'd never have again. The story hadn't begun because a king insulted a human in a dining hall. It began because, for the first time in 700 years, someone loved him enough to tell him the truth.